Hello and welcome to Insight, everyone. I'm Nnamdi Odipo. The plan for this episode is to take a look at a couple of topical issues. I have a conversation lined up on the 16 days of activism against gender-based violence in Nigeria. My guest and I will talk about the prevalence, the gains being made, arising from increased awareness and advocacy, as well as the challenges that remain. I'd also engage another guest on another topic, quite germane as well. It is on the imperatives for commemorating the International Day for Persons with Disability and how the strive for inclusion continues amidst factors like stereotyping and discrimination. Mind you, all of this is happening, all of these subsisting challenges are there despite the improved policy and regulatory landscape in Nigeria. We will begin with our first conversation presently.
Whatever the issues are,
the National Assembly is constitutionally empowered to scrutinize,
however complex or intricate.
We have involved all the academia, the members of the academia. We have involved the academies.
Be it government policies or in fact any issue of public concern.
Our job is to help you gain clarity and make sense of it all.
This is not really healthy for our democracy.
There's a lot of aggrievance in terms of who has been in power longest and who becomes the governor of the state.
It's also in the quality of food being consumed.
After all, perception is insight.
And gaining understanding is also getting insight.
Imagine a world where every woman, every girl, and in fact every individual can live free from fear. Fear from violence and fear from the shackles of oppression. I'm talking about a world where equality, justice, and dignity are not just ideal or ideas, but they are realities. But for millions of Nigerians, that idyllic world remains a distant dream. Take the issue of gender-based violence, for instance, and how that continues to ravage our communities, leaving scars that may never fully heal for many, women and girls. As is now the case, this year again, Nigeria joins the rest of the world to mark the 16 days of activism against gender-based violence. But what happens beyond this seeming global chorus? What gains have we made? And what concrete steps or actions are being taken to address the challenges that remain? Are individuals, are families and organizations, even the government, are they all playing their part in creating a safer, more equitable society for all? There are questions, plenty of questions. For my guest, who is already here with me in the studio, she is Dr. Mufaliat Fijabi. She is the Executive Director of Sustainable Gender Action Initiative. Doctor, thank you for coming on Insights and welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me. Good afternoon.
Yes, so I think it's best we establish the rationale for pushing this activism against GBV, as it were. Yes, the campaigns have since started. As a matter of fact, they started Monday, November 25, and the activism would end Tuesday, December 10, 2024. But the underlying issues are there, and let's talk about them. We know that today in places like Asia, places like the Middle East, we still see, and there are cases where women are killed in the name of honor. You do something, your family considers it dishonorable, you're killed. In West Africa here, Nigeria in particular, women and girls remain and have been victims of gender-based violence, incest, rape, physical abuse, verbal abuse. Sometimes girls are denied, access to food. They are forced into marriages. Young girls are subjected to genital mutilation, all in the name of tradition. So, Doc, in terms of cause and effect or causes and effects, what are some of those issues, that have not only remained stubborn, but they are proving difficult to uproot, to remove? And what are the consequences that we see today in society, playing out prominently among young women or young girls in our society?
Okay, thank you very much for having me. The 16 days of activism against gender-based violence is a time to increase action around the need to eliminate all forms of violence that is gender-based. There are quite a number of instances globally that impact on the lives of women and girls all over the world. We call it gender-based violence and ending all forms of gender-based violence, which means that if it's gender-based, it also affects men and boys. But because the prevalence of violence impacts on the lives of women and girls more, it's seeming like we're putting out the activism to ensure that girls and women enjoy their right to life and have the deserved dignity of the human person that they deserve. If you talk about gender-based violence and looking at Nigeria as a case study, the fact that we have a Violence Against Persons Prohibition Act 2015 in place means that there are acts of violence that needs to be taken care of. And that's why the government of Nigeria signed into law that Violence Against Persons Prohibition Act of 2015. Today we have states across Nigeria that have adopted different versions of that VAP law at the state level to ensure that there is the necessary legal framework in place to protect the citizens at the state level. But having said that, we need to understand the fact that when we talk about violence, it's not separate from cultural practices that promote actions that lead to violence against women and girls. If you take domestic violence, for example, you cannot separate it from patriarchy and power, which we are used to in the West African setting. You talk about power, you see men, holding on to the power, whether in the formal setting or in the informal setting. And women, again, are regarded as second-class citizens. While cultural practices promote this, it is not the best because it gives room for continuous oppression. And that's why when we talk about domestic violence, the law in place, which is the VAPA that I mentioned earlier on, has provisions for adequate protection of the female. I know somebody may feel like, but women also oppress men, but the instances are small. Whether male or female, whether men or women, it is important to understand the fact that no one deserves to experience any form of gender-based violence. So the 16 days of activism, which starts on the 25th of every year, which is the International Day of Elimination of Violence Against Women, and ends on 10th of December, which is the International Human Rights Day, is not just a global chorus, but a time to increase action to ensure that we make visible the need to have no excuses for any form of violence against women and girls. It's a time that you galvanize action, to reach out to everyone, to understand the fact that as human beings, no one deserves to be treated as a second-class citizen. No one deserves to be treated as somebody inhuman. We must respect the dignity of the human person and not perpetrate any form of acts of violence against such person. Taking it further, when we talk about the 16 days of activism, it should actually be all through the year, because if we look at the statistics, according to the United Nations, UN Women, the United Nations Entity for Gender Equality and Empowerment of Women, 1 in every 3 women have experienced one form of violence or the other. Why do we still record this in our society? This is a global statistic, and Nigeria is not an exception. And that's why I would say that there is need for increased awareness on the need for people to understand that they should have respect for one another, that removes any intention to perpetrate acts of violence. Look at the number of cases we've seen recently when it comes to sexual and gender-based violence. You see that a number of cases of incest have been recorded. Why are we having such in our society? You see a number of cases of rape. Why do we need to continue to tolerate that? So this calls for action, and it should be a continuous call for action. If we look at it now, this year, 2024, is the year preluding the year that the Beijing Platform for Action will turn 30 years, with 12 critical areas that is speaking to the need to continue to protect women and to also ensure inclusive participation of women, because you cannot talk about ending violence without also empowering women or without giving the opportunity for women to also participate actively in the governance space. If you recall, during the COVID-19 lockdown, there was a global rampage on the extent to which violence was perpetrated against women. In fact, in Nigeria, a state of emergency was declared because the lockdown now showed the kind of people we are, by the extent of violence being recorded. Why would a lockdown, restriction of movement, lead to an increase in violence? It was not only in Nigeria that we recorded this, it was a global phenomenon. And that particular year was the year that the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action turned 25. So it calls for a lot of deeper reflections.
True.
Deeper reflections in the sense that why was it on the increase by just mere restriction of movement, bringing together of husband, wife in the same physical location at the same time for almost several months. So we need to look deeply at this and to also refreshing our strategies, by re-examining what has worked in ensuring that violence should stop against all persons and what has not worked. We don't want a society where girls will be afraid to go to school for fear of being raped or defiled. We don't want a situation whereby there's consistent domestic violence. There's no peace at home. Remember that the home, the family, constitute the unit of that society that reflects on the kind of larger society that we have.
So, Doc, I have allowed you to go on with your opening statements, and which, of course, has touched on almost just about everything we intend to talk about here. You referenced domestic violence, referenced the disproportionate, the ratio of occurrence amongst the gender, or between the genders, I beg your pardon, being disproportionate. And then you talked about cause effect, came back full circle to the issue of domestic violence and the fact that, in referencing the COVID-19 and the fact that, yes, at that point, maybe families, couples were forced to stay at home, and then we saw a spike in occurrence. That's when I thought, okay, so we've gone full circle back to this issue. So I'd like to zero in on an issue like that, domestic violence, which studies appear to have shown and demonstrate that, is responsible. That's where we see lots of domestic violence occur. I would like for you, Doc, to, and I need your perspective on that, these arising from things that happen within homes. But then, how likely, are some of these issues that you've raised likely to impact on escalation of violence and, perpetuate this circle of gender-based, violence in deeply traditional society like ours, like the one we have here in Nigeria? One, an issue where, for instance, a child, whether a boy now or a girl, sees or witnesses where the mother is being constantly beaten. Two, what happens or how significant is the employment status relative to the woman now? And how does that constitute part of the underlying issue likely to drive escalation of gender-based violence like we see in Nigeria? So these are two issues I would like for you to talk on.
Okay, so if I'm to look at that very deeply, I'll start from the fact that our society still has what we describe as male child preference. So in the end, because of this, you find that a lot of girls are not just out of school, they are disempowered because of lack of education. And at the point that they get married, at times there's, in addition to lack of education, there's also no skills, there's lack of economic empowerment, and they are actually fully dependent. Even though we expect that their needs are taken care of by their spouses in the relationship, but at times complete lack of economic empowerment, lack of education could also impact on the kind of power play within the homes. It could also impact on the relationship. And at the point that it results into battery, and the children witness this, it's really very unfortunate, because most times what we have seen is that the children of such homes feel like that is the norm, and then they take it on for life until maybe they get to a point where they are educated, reorientated on the need to recognize peace as a means of relationship. So if you look at the family setting from an African background, from a cultural background, I think we need to do better in terms of understanding patriarchy, not as a tool for oppression, but as a tool for collaboration, as a tool for respect, as a tool for acknowledgement of the fact that the world cannot stand on one feet. You know, you need the 2 feet, you need the 2 wings to be able to develop processes. And if you look at some of the research findings, it has shown that inequality, which oftentimes leads to gender-based violence, gender-based discrimination, is a key to reducing productivity, is a key to achieving low level of development in any developing country or even in advanced countries. And there is need to pay attention to gender inequality. And when we talk about gender inequality, it's not about men becoming women or women becoming men, because that's the notion that is very common out there. When you talk about gender equality, it means giving equal opportunities to men and women, you know, to enhance their ability to grow and develop and become meaningful players in their families, meaningful players in the society that they belong to. So unequal power relations oftentimes lead to domestic violence, wife battery, and this is not good enough for the kind of society that we envisage. You spoke about the ideal, where there is peace, where there is respect for the dignity of the human person earlier on. It should not remain as an ideal. It should be practicalized.
Okay.
You know, it should be something that we build our nations on, you know, so that there will be peace for everyone.
So in terms of that, Doc, in terms of that, how exactly, like the instance we painted, and now, you know, a child witnessing the mother being beat up could, you know, now engender a cycle of domestic abuse, you know, for life. How exactly, you know, or where exactly do the families now come in? Sometimes, yes, you notice or you know, we witness that the perpetrator is there in the family. So when we now say what is the role of the family now, we could mean the role of maybe not just the immediate family, maybe the extended family now. When we say what is the role of the community, we could mean the community now could be neighbors around this family where these incidents are happening, when we or those around their immediate vicinity. And then, you know, beyond communities, government as well, organizations like yours, what and how do they come in to provide support structure, perhaps counseling, so that children witnessing this sort of abuse or abuses, you know, families impacted can have some sort of support structure. And then we can begin to break that chain, you know, so that we don't have a circle of the same, you know, of gender-based violence continuing from generation to generation, Doc.
Okay, so if you look at it from the angle of the need for prevention,
yes,
there are efforts, you know, which my organization, Sustainable Gender Action Initiative, also have put in place to ensure that there is increased awareness, there is increased sensitization on the need to prevent all forms of violence, you know, gender-based violence. And where there are instances where this violence, you know, are taking place already, like the scenario of children witnessing their parents, you know, battering each other, there are government agencies that have been set up like NAPTIP, you know, that respond to such issues, and then they pay attention to the counseling. There are also civil society organizations, you know, that also respond, you know, to counseling, you know, to giving better reorientation to the children. And when you talk about domestic violence, it's not just battery. We're having an increase in incest, increase in defilement of children. We have sexual assault and referral centers. We have, according to ROLAC, we have about 47 centers across Nigeria now where reports can also be made, so that those who are victims can get immediate attention and support, and also get the necessary counseling, while also preparing all the evidence to ensure that perpetrators also don't go scot-free. I want to emphasize that prevention is critical, but the government has also recognized the need to also punish perpetrators.
Yes.
And that's why we have the Violence Against Persons Prohibition Act in place. So it's no longer a joke. Perpetrating acts of violence just for the sake of doing it is unacceptable. And that's why we all need to make effort to ensure that we don't record this. Where it happens, the laws are there to adequately address.
Do you think the laws are enough? Are you satisfied with the level of prosecution of perpetrators, and do you think it's adequate enough? Sometimes fines are provided and penalties for perpetrators. Do you think this has done enough as deterrent to, forestall and, stop some of what we're seeing play out across Nigeria?
So from what we've seen so far, while the legal framework is there, it's a milestone. We can always hope for more laws to continue to protect Nigerian citizens. But at the same time, we've recorded successes, of perpetrators of violence, especially in cases of rape, defilement, and incest. We've seen instances of the perpetrators going to jail. Some have been handed life jail terms because of this. But what I'm saying is that before it got to that point, why don't we deploy the prevention
mechanisms?
If you have respect for somebody, the best way to do that is to avoid any form of violence or physical assault or sexual assault. Once this is seen as a rule, it also protects you from becoming a victim. But where this is not respected, it is very good to also ensure that they face the real music of the law in terms of being handed over the desired punishment. But what we're saying is that we should not make cases of gender-based violence those that are private anymore. It's not a private matter. When you talk about gender-based violence, it's a public matter. Instances it could, like the case of rape, is a crime against humanity. It's criminal.
Sure.
So we should not abort this, and we should make efforts to report to the appropriate agencies of government to ensure that we have a normalized society where people also stay away from violence.
So
the fact that we've described this as gender-based violence is enough to, to drive us on reflection and thinking, and to ensure that we do not encourage its occurrence.
So, Doc, I figure that even in this case, what we say and sometimes passes for colloquialism, that prevention is better than cure. It also applies in this case. Would it therefore be presumptuous of me to assume that, gender-based violence can dramatically reduce? Maybe we can significantly curb it if feminist advocacy are championed and perhaps driven by male allies. I'm talking about, the sexual and physical assaults that are reported, or maybe those those that go unreported. I'm talking about, that's the intimate partner violence and violations that we hear of, and the many that are unheard of, the constant emotional abuses that women complain of, and even those that they often choose to let go, to ignore. This whole mix of ugly and unfortunate occurrences, which are proportionate to women and young girls, even though we know they happen to boys sometimes, would it make a whole lot of difference if the gender largely held responsible as perpetrators are also largely responsible for leading the charge against gender-based violence in a country like Nigeria?
Yes, there's a global campaign around E for She's, which speaks to men also taking on the campaign to ensure that there is no excuse for any form of gender-based violence. And this, I think, would help reduce the instances of seeing men as perpetrators all the time, but as campaigners against all forms of sexual and gender-based violence. And I also think that this would continue to enlighten the young boys coming up, to also believe in the cause of preventing and not being perpetrators of any form of gender-based violence. So the campaign is a global one for he for she's, and it's something that all men and boys should be part of. At the same time, women are also for men, because we've also started recording increase in the kind of violence that boys experience from boys and from some women as well. So, and that's why we keep saying it's not just about ending violence against women and girls alone. It's about ending all forms of gender-based violence. When you talk about gender-based violence, it means that it involves men, women, boys, and girls. But because women have been at the receiving end for years, is why we're saying stop all forms of violence against women and girls, and let's have a peaceful world.
Doc, in rounding off our conversation, earlier on you referenced productivity. I think I noted it down there, and how gender-based violence could very well impact productivity. Is it therefore your submission that it could, and do you agree by that, especially for those who argue that yes, it impacts not just their reproductive health now for women, but that it does impact, a nation's general well-being, a nation's development, and a nation's economy as well. Is that your submission as well?
Yes, that's my submission. Where you continue to record gender imbalance, it impacts on the overall productivity of a country. It also impacts on the functionality of families and the overall growth of the country. So,
what is then your call to action for?
My call to action is that there should be no form of excuse at all for perpetrating any form of gender-based violence, so that we can enjoy and reap the fruits of having a society that is balanced, that has respect for every human being, both male and female.
Dr. Mufiliat Fijabi, Executive Director, Sustainable Gender Action Initiative. I would like to thank you so much for coming on the program. It's been a delight listening to you speak on this issue. Your thoughts have been quite profound, I must say, and quite insightful. Thank you so much for coming on our program.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.